We're here with Dave, and we're here to talk about QRA. So before we get stuck into it, can you explain what QRA is, Dave?
Yeah, hi, Mike. It's a quick reaction alert. And so it's having aircraft fighters on standby, ready to deal with any situation that might crop up in the area of interest in the airspace, either around the UK or around Falklands, which is my experience. And you need to get aircraft into the air very quickly and respond to orders in order to negate a threat or do something like that.
Yeah, so how many bases in the UK is QRA? Is it just two, or was there more in your time?
Yeah, so in my time, there was two, Northern QRA, Southern QRA. It changes from time to time. It changes depending upon the threat. But we were flying from both Lookers and Coningsby, and I know certainly that they'll fly from Lossy and Coningsby today.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about your time on the F3 on QRA. Can you talk us through it and a kind of typical day in the shed and on Q, as it were?
My experience on the F3 was in all of my tours. That was 43 Squadron, Treble 1 Squadron 56, so the OCU did QRA as well. We even did Q on Saturdays because we didn't get deployed. So the OCU instructors did a Saturday, selfless instructors doing a Saturday QRA. And I also did the QRA on 1435 in the Falklands as well. I guess it's worth talking about, how you set yourself up for QRA in the first place. You need to do a bit of training in order to get going with QRA. And that involves, basic stuff, but it's actually quite difficult when you're doing it in bad weather. So we did intercepts, of course, against multiple evading targets, and we did visual identification procedures against those. So what does that mean? Visual identifying an aircraft is relatively easy in blue sky conditions, but if it's in cloud or at night with the target with the lights off, it can be a bit more challenging, of course. And so we would do these visual identification procedures where you would get behind a target and then approach them in the cloud using the radar to get really close. The navigator monitoring the radar, the pilot flying a dot. So he's got a head-up display with some directions using a dot and a small circle, so you can follow that in and you get to a really close range from the target, and then you might be able to see it at that point. You also have to do some shadowing of targets. So imagine that you had visually identified a target and you were then told to follow the target around to monitor the target. You do that within weapons range. So that would be about a mile away from behind the target. And of course, if there's multiple targets, then you need to you have your radar looking at all of the targets, and you need to be able to follow them around. That was quite an intense activity. So that was part of the training as well. And the final part of training, really, before I get on to kind of a typical day in the Q shed, would be to do a practice scramble. So on the squadron, you would go and set up an aircraft as if it was in QRA. So we'll come on to that in a minute. You cock the jet like you would cock a gun, get it ready, and then sit in the crew room and then get a scramble message, and then go and intercept, obviously testing at that point that you can get into the air in a suitable amount of time, which is pretty quick. And then once you're in the air, you go after a target. To identify a target, you actually don't know what the target's going to be. So it could be anyone, really. And if somebody goes in a flight plan and they put on the remarks in the flight plan, embellish, the word embellish, it means that they could be used as a target for QRA. And so on my particular training practice scramble, we went after a German twin-engine transport aircraft, which turned out to be a Transall, and so that was the aircraft that had been selected. And we came alongside, identified the Transall, and job done. And so typical day for air crew, it was a 24-hour duty for air crew. It's worth mentioning that it was a 7-day duty for the engineers. So for the air crew, it was about managing fatigue and flying. So 24 hours and then off you go. So that's good. For the engineers, it's a little bit more about husbandry of live armed aircraft. You want to be, you don't be just doing that for 24 hours. You want to be looking after the jets and looking after them for a period of, say, 7 days, which they did. And so we do Q as air crew 2 or 3 times a month, and they would do it 2 or 3 times a year, something like that. And on the day itself, so for the air crew, you would get there, you would have your Met brief. Of course, it's a really expansive Met brief because you could go so far in QRA. You could go up, up towards the Faroe Islands. And you'd also have an intelligence brief. And the aircraft and all the classified information be handed over to you from the off-going crews. And then you would go out to the aircraft. Now, I talked about cocking the aircraft. I'll talk about that in a minute. But the aircraft's already ready to go at a moment's notice. But of course, you'd want to go and check the aircraft. So you go out with the engineers. They'll do a quick servicing of the aircraft. And on the F3, the pilot would go around the aircraft, check the weapons on board the aircraft, and the nav would jump in the back, get the power on the aircraft, and warm up the navigation system and check out the comms. So you've got confidence in the aircraft. And when I first was in the F3, the navigation system was pretty clunky. It was mechanical gyros, and every 8 hours you had to go out to the Q-jet and you had to warm up the nav system and do an alignment. Alignment in that aircraft used to take 12 minutes, 13 minutes, something like that. And that's too long for a Q scramble. So you'd align it and then you would memorize the heading. But that memory alignment, which would normally take about 2 minutes normally, so that's good. But that memory sort of lapses after about 8 hours. So every 8 hours you'd be out warming up the jet and getting the navigation system ready. And other thing, typical things on QRA, you'd be wearing your immersion suit for QRA. And that doesn't matter what the temperature is back home. It could be a 25-degree day if that's possible at Lookers in the middle of the summer, but you'd be wearing an immersion suit for the whole day because you don't know where you're going, and it could be, as say, up to the Faroes Iceland Gap, and you're going to need your goon suit on at that point. But once you had set yourself up on Q, you would get back into the shed, settle down, do a bit of work, really. It was great when you're a flight commander because you could catch up on all the paperwork that you couldn't do on the squadron when you're flying on the squadron, doing the instruction on the squadron. The paperwork can get behind, so you catch up on the paperwork and basically be ready to go at a moment's notice.
What was the food situation like? Did you just have to make up sandwiches so they were easy to go? Or did you have an oven? What was it like in the shed?
It was pretty good, actually. We had a chef who came down from one of the messes. I guess they came down. Did they come down twice a day? Lunch and dinner. We sorted ourselves out for breakfast. And I remember down in the Falklands, we had a pretty good kitchen, so we'd go and do our own stuff as well. So it was pretty good food.
Good stuff, yeah. One benefit anyway. But so what were the differences between the F3 and the Typhoon on QRA? I'm guessing you saw that changeover.
I did. So obviously the Typhoon performance is great compared to the F3. When I talked about visual identification, what I didn't mention on the F3 was that if the target was up in sort of the mid to high 40,000 feet and down under the speed of sound, so Mach 0.7, Mach 0.8, kind of typical airliner stuff, maybe a little bit higher than that. That's pretty tough for an F3. An F3 can go up that height, but generally it wants to be flying fast at that height. And so it's quite difficult to get up and stabilize alongside an airliner at the mid 40s at 0.7 Mach. Mm-hmm. And so you'd have to do this Mach 1.3 intercept, where you would come charging towards the target and start your final turn at about 20 miles or something, because then distances are closing really quickly. And then you would try to use that Mach 1.3 speed at about 30,000 feet to then climb up and stabilize beside the aircraft at 47,000 feet. For a Typhoon, that's easy. So they've got the performance, which is great for the high level stuff. And they really thought about it in the design in terms of getting into the air quickly in the Typhoon. Again, there's a few things that I remember. One is that there's an APU switch on the outside of the aircraft. So you can get the APU, the auxiliary power unit, which you need to start the engines. You can get that going as you kind of run up the steps, which is cool. Once you are in on a Typhoon, I think you just put the engines to idle and then they start, whereas, it'd be one at a time on the F3, use the start switch, and that's after you've started the APU being inside the aircraft. So it's not necessarily going to make it much quicker, but it's definitely going to give you more capacity to do other things, and it's definitely going to be easier. And the final thing I remember about the Typhoon was that there's a display called the auto queue, and the auto queue basically is the startup screen. It's on one of the multifunction displays, and it's telling you all the things that haven't been done yet. Okay. Including things like pins. So there's a picture of 2 pins. Once those pins are stowed in the right place and the seat's live and everything else is live, those pins disappear. So that's the type of thing. And once that screen is clear and once you have a big green go in the middle, you're ready to go. And as I say, that's pretty good. Not necessarily to get you into the air quicker, but to get you into the air in good order. I mean, imagine being scrambled at 3 a.m. from deep sleep. It's quite nice to have an auto cue to tell you that everything's in place. And I remember that, from our perspective in the F3 going flying, the long poles in a tent were the engines, getting them started, and the nav system, as I discussed. Not difficult, but you didn't have an auto queue. We did the pre-takeoff checks, just as pilot would do for themselves in a Typhoon, but we had a challenge response pre-takeoff checks in the F3. There weren't many challenge response checks in the F3, but pre-takeoff was one. And you would flash through those. There was always time to do them. But in terms of belt and braces and just making sure that, hey, we're getting in the air, you might be getting in the air 5 minutes from the scramble point. You kind of go through wings, flaps, pins, strapped in, pins out. And obviously the pilot's going to check the engines as well. Just before, so they're kind of like the crucial things. But you will have done all of the rest of the checks. That's just like a belt and braces. Let's just go through those things again and make sure that we're in good order to get into the air safely.
Probably never happened, but in the unlikely situation that both jets failed, was there like a backup plan of what to do?
Yeah, well, remember there's more than one base, and I don't remember ever failing to get airborne in a Q jet. The record of getting those aircraft into the air is pretty damn good. But of course, imagine there was a scenario where there's quite a lot of Q activity and it's ongoing. Well, in the background, you probably wouldn't be surprised to hear that there are other aircraft on the base ready to go. So you can backfill. Once the Q aircraft fly away, we backfill with live armed aircraft that are ready to backfill.
Yeah.
So there's always resilience there.
Absolutely. And I'm sure you have many stories, but can you maybe share a few memorable times from your time on Q?
Yes. I think when we spoke the last time, I talked about an Argentinian intercept that I did. So probably worth mentioning that one more time quickly about that was against a Grumman S2 tracker, which was operating right on the edge of the UK area of interest down in the Falklands. That was a really interesting intercept, just because the aircraft was kind of hiding below low cloud, and it was a long way out to sea, and it was going really slowly. So as we intercepted it, we had visually identified it, but we recorded the information. But we had to do this racetrack around it and keep with it, and so it was quite hard to do that between the weather and the really slow speed of that aircraft. But that went well. I've been involved in another really interesting scramble. Limited details I can give you, but myself and the guy I was with, Foxy, we got within 10 miles of an Argentinian fast jet. That was operating just outside the area of interest. So, of course, we didn't actually see him in the end. And one other thing that springs to mind is, and it's not my dit to spin really, because I wasn't flying, but I was an observer and involved in it. And it's a really bizarre Q incident down in the Falklands. Now, I was the authorizing officer on the day. So one of the more experienced aircrew who looks at the weather, makes decisions on, the training flying. And when people go flying, especially if the weather's not brilliant, go up to the tower and be there to watch the weather and help out with any emergencies that might happen. Well, so I was the authorizing officer, and there was a slow-moving aircraft coming towards the Falkland Islands. And it was poor weather that day, but the decision was eventually made. This is still coming towards the area of interest. The decision was made to send one of the jets out to see what was going on. So I popped up to the tower, as I would do as the authorizing officer of the day. And so I was able to tune in to what was going on the radio and watch what was going on the radar. And off they went, and they came across a Piper Apache, so it's a twin-engined aircraft coming towards the Falklands in really poor weather. It was dodging the weather. And of course, just like that Grumman S2 tracker, that had been flying very slowly and quite difficult to intercept. But they did manage to intercept it, and they managed to speak to the person on board. There was just one person on board, and that person was saying that they were a bit tired and they were running out of fuel. The aircraft had actually flown from Argentina, and it, not the closest point in Argentina. It was actually quite far away in Argentina. So that was plausible that it was running out of fuel. And the decision was made to land it at our airfield. And I think they asked the pilot whether they got him in the right frequency. They asked him whether he'd done an instrument approach before. No. Do you have any experience in bad weather? No. Okay, so they gave him a non-precision approach. It's like a surveillance radar approach, where they gave him headings to fly down the runway, so they're down the line of the runway, and heights to be at, or advisory heights to be at. So you're at 4 miles, you should be at 1,000 feet, 3 miles, 750, and so forth for a particular glide slope. And it was very surreal being stood in the tower looking at this really low cloud base, which was below the minimum decision height for that procedure for sure, and seeing this twin engine thing pop out the bottom of the cloud and land on the runway. Yeah, very surreal. So it was a guy, I remember his name was Ernesto, I guess, and he'd flown from the US and he'd flown to Argentina, and then he decided to fly to the Falklands. Nobody knew he was going to fly to the Falklands. And on board, he had 2,300 tea bags. That was one for each of the Falkland Islanders. And he had 50 oranges, I think, and some flour. And they were for the military people. And so it was kind of like some sort of goodwill gesture and peace mission, I think. And but all he found at the end of the runway was the British Army waiting for him. Promptly handed him over to the Falkland Islands police, and they took him back to Stanley. And so it was a really odd day.
It's bizarre.
But it was bizarre, yeah. Both governments played it really well, They treated it for what it was, which was the actions of an eccentric. And we waited for a couple of days until the weather really improved, and we gave this guy a really good brief and sent him on his way back towards Argentina. So that was very, very strange. 1998, I think that was. There's quite a lot. All the information I've given you there is online somewhere.
Yeah. So was there news articles on it at the time?
Yeah, there was. Sparse, but there were news articles. A couple in the UK and a couple down in Argentina as well.
And obviously, flying Q in the Falklands, you also flew clean as well, so that must have been a lot nicer than the UK.
Yeah, exactly. In the UK, you fly with the 2250 litre tanks on, which are the big tanks. They can go to Mach 1.2, but they really reduce the G limit on the aircraft, and make the aircraft pretty cumbersome, especially with all the rockets on board as well. And of course, when I'm talking about, just an aside, talking about tanks limiting the G on an aircraft, of course, tanks can be released at any point. So if you get it, not quite a QRA scenario, but if you get into a fight, then the tanks are coming off before you meet the other aircraft, so you've got your maximum G limit available.
Yeah, absolutely. So can you talk about your time as the Tactical Commander of QRA, what this was and what it involved?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, that kind of gives me a relatively unique perspective on Q, given that I have been flying on QRA and over 3 tours plus my time in the Falklands. But then my final job in the Air Force was as one of the tactical commanders, and that was in the bunker at High Wycombe, so the nuclear bunker at High Wycombe. And of course, so that sounds like a more sensitive end of the business. And QRA is an ongoing task right now, the RAF's most important task. But during my time there, we can come on to it, but there was an incident where, as a result of that incident, there was a decision to make QRA more open and brief people about QRA and give people reassurance and also serve as a deterrence as well. So it's quite helpful for this discussion because we can talk about things that are in the public domain. But if you're going to talk about the sort of the command and control side of it and the job I did as the tactical commander, it's worth talking about the mission itself. Now, there's 2 main missions for QRA. One is the NATO mission, which a lot of people will be really familiar with, and that's kind of a military mission. Again, reassurance, deterrence. And the second mission is the national mission. And it's effectively countering the 9/11 scenario. It's a counter-terrorism. So you've got one mission that's looking against the nefarious state actors, and another mission which is nefarious non-state actors. And those are the two missions that you do. And of course, the Typhoon these days, and as was when I was the tactical commander, is the weapons platform. And then chain of command wise, above the weapons platform, you have the tactical controllers, the TACON. And that's the control and reporting centers. When I was there, that was a Bulmer and at Scampton. So effectively the fighter controllers, they call them air battle space managers now, but in my day, fighter controllers, and they would actually, they've got access to all the military radars, and they can actually see all of the civilian radars as well. And they're the people that direct the fighter towards the targets, and also pass on the commands and the missions, what they've got to do, identify it, shadow it, do whatever the command is at that point. And of course, that command is coming from the tactical commander. That was coming from me. I was making all the decisions on QRA, and it's called TACOM and sits in that headquarters at RAF High Wycombe. It's the National Air Defence Operations Centre, the NADOC. And my role was called, I call it tactical commander there, but the role is actually called national representative. And for short, that's NatRep. So I was one of the NatReps because it's a 24/7 thing. So there's quite a few NatReps. And it's a really interesting end of the operation. QRA is not just an RAF operation. It's led by the RAF. Mm-hmm. It actually involves 4 government departments. And the NatRep in the HQ bunker, in policing terms, so people might be familiar with this, is effectively the gold commander. So everybody, all of those government departments are working to the NatRep. And so it was quite a nice little to have your own sort of fiefdom in the QRA world. And one of the most important, or one of the most interesting things, should I say, for people when they learn about QRA, and again, it was a thing that was unfolded about 10 years ago, is the red phone. So there is actually a red phone in the bunker, and that goes through to Downing Street. And as the NatRep, during certain operations, I might be giving the commands, taking information from my team about what the other government departments are telling us, but also at the same time have the red phone in my hand speaking to the Prime Minister or another senior government minister.
Obviously a big responsibility. Were you prepared for this role, and can you share any memorable stories from your time there?
Well, there's a lot of training. And of course, I talked about the training for QRA. There's training for the people in the front line. There's training for the control and reporting centres. The training for the headquarters. I think my training prior to being sort of declared combat ready as a NatRep was about 6 weeks. That was pretty intense. The training, as I recall, involves multiple simulations per day. So you don't just sit on your backside and do nothing. There are simulations, and sometimes no notice simulations. And if I wasn't on shift, then I might have been the person who made up the really devious scenario for the person who was on shift. And the more devious, the better. The more interesting, the better, because it gets your brain thinking. And the more you practice different scenarios, the better you'll be prepared for the real event. But the training wasn't just sort of internal simulations like that. Training, it also included full events. So several times per year, the whole system, including the Prime Minister, gets involved. And so, it's the question is, do you feel ready? You're definitely as ready as you can be. Mm-hmm. And you're talking about things like a 9/11 scenario. That's pretty grim.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing that I emphasized to my team on a regular basis was, our job is not to think too much about that grim scenario, but be ready for it. Be ready by putting that weapons platform, the Typhoon. Our job is to put it in the right place at the right time in order to give people options. If you can't have the weapons platform there, you've got no options. So that was our role, really, to put that weapons platform right place, right time.
Yeah, so if you can share maybe a memorable story from your time there, because I think you had one, and it led to an interesting documentary on Sky, I think, that came out after that, didn't it?
Yeah, I've got a couple of things I thought about. One is that incident that you just talked about, and there's another one that happened just a few months after that. So I can cover both of those. Mm-hmm. So the first one was in 2014, and you mentioned it ended up in a Sky News article. I'll talk about the incident in a second, but the day after the incident, David Cameron was heard discussing the incident. So I think it was Sky microphones were at an event. It was a military honours and award event, and he was chatting away to some military people and overheard talking about this incident the night before. And he actually said he couldn't sleep. So that got that piqued the interest of Sky News. And at that point, the decision was taken, we're trying to reassure, we're trying to deter. Why not be more open about the QRA operation? And within 6 months, actually probably within less, Sky News were inside the bunker. Sky News were flying alongside QRA aircraft and doing about a 30-minute piece, which is really good. Just the sort of things we've talked about already today, but a really good expose on what goes on in QRA. And so the incident that I'm talking about was of an evening, and it was a Latvian cargo plane. It was an Antonov AN-26. If you remember one of those, it's basically the Russian ripoff of the Fokker Friendship, or the F-27. Mm-hmm. I can't remember what the NATO reporting name is, but it was an AN-26 anyway. And I got a call as the tactical commander. I got a call from my equivalent in France. So a colonel from France called me and said, "Hey, we've got this guy heading towards your airspace," and he was meant to be coming to the UK. I think he was going to Birmingham. And he said he's not been speaking to us for a while, and he's coming towards your airspace. So that was coming towards Kent with a flight plan that overflew London, and it didn't take me long to get the aircraft ordered to scramble from Coningsby. And as the NAT rep, as I say, you're making all the decisions and giving the mission. So I'm the person who can authorize supersonic flight. So I authorized, given the scenario, given the time and space scenario, I ordered supersonic flight for those aircraft, which isn't as bad as it sounds, because in order to be effective, you need to do that supersonic dash once you're at height. So once the aircraft are at height and then they accelerate to supersonic speed, you're not going to be doing damage on the ground. You're certainly going to be making a noise, and people will hear it, but you won't be doing any damage on the ground. So the aircraft were ordered supersonic, and they met this Latvian aircraft, which was still not speaking. Imagine imagine crossing the boundary into somebody else, from France into British airspace as a pilot or a co-pilot, one of these things, and not trying to speak to somebody. It's like, okay, this is looking suspicious. So they were met over Kent, over Dover, something like that, still heading towards London at that point. And of course, at that point, just before the intercept, I was on the red phone speaking to the Prime Minister. And what I can't do is talk about the escalation and the procedures. But there's some good stuff on the Sky News piece, which talks about warnings. And also some people who were listening to the radios that night recorded the warnings. So you can go online, you can hear the warnings, and they're pretty stark, which is follow my orders or you will be shot down. And they were given some warnings, and lo and behold, they woke up. And at that point, you're thinking, why on earth has somebody not been speaking for 20 minutes, including crossing an international border? So, it's not that you just say, oh, well, you're now speaking, that's fine, off you go. At that point, it's kind of like, just to be on the safe side, they were escorted into Stansted Airport and met on the ground by the police. And, every time we had an incident like that, I think in my few years down the bunker, I probably had 20 incidents that were similar to that, and probably not quite as tasty in terms of positioning and the timing, but probably about 20 incidents like that. But every time things ran on rails. So it does tell you the training pays. The other one, just to complete the two missions that I talked about on QRA, the other one was in 2015, so after the first one, and was one of the NATO missions. And so that involved a pair of Russian Bear bombers, and they'd come around the North Cape, and they come down the coast of Norway, and they'd already been intercepted by the Norwegians. And in fact, I sent the aircraft from Lossiemouth to intercept them as well, and they continued down and flew to the west of Ireland. And as they flew to the west of Ireland, they normally continue to fly down south towards the Bay of Biscay and then return up. But we were waiting for them with Coningsby. And of course, we've got a tanker as well, got refueling capability, which is great. And they turned up the English Channel. And this was the first time that the Russians had ever come up the English Channel. They've done it more than once, but this was the first time. And they came up to somewhere just off Bournemouth before they turned round. Mm-hmm. It's worth talking about, how the Russians behave and what they're up to when they come towards the UK. Because people talk about airspace. They say, the briefing is always the Russians didn't enter UK airspace, but they were in our area of interest. Mm-hmm. It's not exactly clear what that means. So let me tell you. UK airspace is the airspace within 12 nautical miles of the shore, mm-hmm. of the coastline of the UK. So that is our national sovereign airspace. So when those bears came up the English Channel, they never breached that 12 nautical mile line. That is absolutely, a red line to cross. And the area of interest that you talk about is the UK flight information region, or the series of flight information regions that the UK is responsible for. And National Air Traffic Services are responsible for sort of the safe and expeditious passage of all aircraft within this huge area that comes from near the Faroes all the way down to the middle of the English Channel. and that is the UK area of interest. Now, within that, we've got a lot of civilian aircraft flying, and the problem with the Russians is that they are flying without a flight plan. They're flying without speaking to anyone, and they're flying without using a transponder. And so, one of the really important things about transponder is, firstly, all civilian radars can see the transponder. Military radar can see anything, but all civilian radars can see the transponder. More importantly, probably the height as well. So transponder, the mode Charlie of a transponder gives the height of the aircraft. There's none of that going on. So it's definitely reckless. It's definitely irresponsible. Some people might call it dangerous. But what is interesting is that, when we've got these guys coming into the UK area of interest, we scramble aircraft and we go to see what they're up to. And effectively at that point, I used to call it babysitting. We're babysitting the Russians because you've got to be with them. They can't be trusted to be safe. So whilst you're with them, babysitting them, you can report their position, you can report their height. And all of this is communicated to civilian air traffic control as well. And so even on that day, just off of Bournemouth, I tell you, you go on Flight Radar 24 at 11 o'clock in the morning and have a look at the area just south of Bournemouth. It's rammed with aircraft. So it could have been potentially dangerous, but it wasn't dangerous. It was reckless. It was completely under control of the military and the civilian air traffic controllers at that time. But it was really interesting, and I think the team did a good job that day. They always tend to do a good job. One of the more interesting aspects for me was that I talked about my opposite number in France giving me a call for the previous incident. Well, of course, I was on the phone to the French throughout that. And effectively, as the Russians were going up the English Channel, you had Typhoons to the north from the UK, and you had Mirages on the south from France. And so it was all pretty well nailed down, and it was a pretty good demonstration of how NATO can coordinate. So that's my two kind of interesting things to tell you about from my time as a tactical commander.
Yeah, so overall, did you enjoy your role flying in QRA and obviously as the tactical commander?
Flying QRA was great because, every time you ran to the aircraft, your heart is thumping. It's exciting stuff, in between the long drawn out periods of sitting on the ground, catching up with people. And I used to joke on the tactical commander stuff that it's just like being on QRA without the prospect of flying, which makes it sound terrible. But, because of that, for government department, multi-layered, multi-agency approach, it was really, really interesting, and working with some really interesting people in government, and I really enjoyed my time doing that.
Great stuff. Well, thank you for sharing some of your stories and telling us what QRA is all about. But Dave, thank you very much for coming back on the show. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks, Mike. No problem.